Hello, and welcome to The Brief, a podcast that brings analysis and perspectives on key issues in global affairs. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. Our focus in this episode is the staggering toll of journalists killed in Gaza and U.S. support for Israel in what international experts say now meets the legal definition of a genocide. Western journalists, of course, are barred from on-the-ground reporting of events there, and the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists documents that nearly 200 Palestinian reporters, photographers, and media workers have been killed since the latest conflict erupted. CPJ notes that, unlike other conflicts, journalists aren't just collateral damage, but they have become targets, sometimes with accusations that they are members of Hamas or other terror groups, claims steadfastly denied by media organizations and the journalists themselves. Well, human rights groups have also become targets in different ways. Now, the U.S. moved to sanction 3 Palestinian rights groups. Secretary of State Marco Rubio blamed the groups Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights for requesting the International Criminal Court, or ICC, to investigate Israeli war crimes. The ICC subsequently issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and a former defense chief. It's also issued warrants for key Hamas members blamed for the October 7th, 2023 attacks on Israelis. To get some perspective on what all of this means, we're joined by the Israel and Palestine Director of Human Rights Watch, Omar Shakir. Hello, and welcome to The Brief.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin here with the 3 Palestinian rights groups. What do these U.S. State Department sanctions really mean for them? What effect do they have?
These sanctions could have wide-ranging implications. These sanctions issued as per an executive order that President Trump issued early in his administration could impact the ability of these organizations to use the international banking system, which of course affects their ability to pay their employees and to operate. It also has an impact on their potential ability to use different services and products, email servers, other means of their operations, because there are requirements upon different actors to comply with U.S. sanctions. And of course, given the U.S.'s power in the world, U.S.-based organizations, have a duty to comply with these obligations, even if they're completely out of step with international law and human rights principles. It also affects the ability of outside organizations to potentially partner and work with organizations like Al-Mizan, Al-Haq, and PCHR. These are prominent civil society organizations that have deep partnerships across countries like the United States, and these sanctions could impose consequences upon organizations and other stakeholders who engage Al-Haq. It could have impacts, of course, on U.S. nationals that work with Al-Haq. So the implications are broad and really go to the very heart of the ability of these organizations to actually operate. And it isn't just limited to the United States, because these sanctions really manifest themselves often in the international banking system, and many other countries have obligations that grow out of these sanctions. So it could really have wide-ranging implications affecting the very ability of these organizations to operate.
In justifying the move, Secretary Rubio published a statement, or posted a statement, saying that the reason he was doing this was because they failed to seek Israel's consent before they went to The Hague and filed their complaint. Does that even make sense?
No, it's a ridiculous claim, but this is clearly a vindictive and thuggish move by the Trump administration to target human rights defenders for doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, which is documenting grave crimes and campaigning for accountability for the victims of those crimes. And of course, groups like Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, PCHR have been on the front lines of doing this, not just in the last 2 years amid the wide-ranging atrocities in Gaza, but they've been on the front line of doing this for decades. Al-Haq is one of the oldest civil society organizations in the entire Arab world. They've been around for almost half a century. They are one of the most respected global human rights organizations in the global south. They've won awards from prominent European governments. The Carter Center has, of course, recognized them. And Mizan and PCHR are also very reputable organizations, and they have continued to do their incredibly valuable research and advocacy work despite their staff living in Gaza for the most part. So living amid the mass starvation, the mass killing, and the unimaginable circumstances of being based in Gaza. So, I mean, you're really talking here about sanctions against human rights groups for doing what they do. Let's remember, sanctions are supposed to be a tool to prevent, prevent future abuse by abusers. It's not meant to go after those who are actually trying to ensure those abusers get accountability. So the U.S. has this exactly backwards.
Well, man, the U.S. is such a powerful force, as you have said. But we look at the entire world scene, and there seems to be a complete loss of interest in human rights. I mean, people aren't standing up. They look on at Gaza, they see what's there, they hear, this panel of experts saying that it meets the legal definition of a genocide against the Palestinians, and yet you don't see the mass media in the West reacting in the same way you would expect.
Look, I think in many ways Gaza has been the litmus test for so many because it's taken the principles of accountability, of justice, of the very foundations of the international world order in many ways, but certainly international humanitarian human rights law, and it's tested particularly institutions in the global north to say, how strong is your commitment to these principles? Are you willing to hold them against a powerful state that is an ally of many countries in Europe and in the global north, more generally? And I think, of course, many governments have failed this test. They've simply shown no political will to actually, state reality for what it is, much less to take the sort of actions that a situation of this gravity warrants. Now, I will note that others have responded, right? I think you've seen international justice institution, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, even for the most part, the UN, where there has been robust statements and action taken by those bodies in line with their mandates. And I do think when you look at civil society and popular movements around the world, they've also been vocal. And within many of these institutions in Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia, you have seen internal fractures and debate and discussion, within these institutions. It's not just government institutions, as you know, it's media institutions, it's unions, it's many of these different bodies, and things have come out in different ways, but clearly, for the most part, these governments have failed to act. And I think, the result has been those principles that grew out of the ashes of World War II are being literally destroyed in the ruins of Gaza. And of course, it's not over, right? We saw more than 2 million people on the ground whose fate hangs in the balance. So despite all the failures over 2 years, it's not too late to act. But of course, if the international community continues to fail amid the prospect now of further assault in Gaza City, further discussion of mass forced displacement, the implications will, of course, be far beyond Palestinians. It'll affect the protections of civilians all across the world.
Now, in the midst of all of this, probably the key eyewitnesses to what has happened in Gaza on the ground, documenting things, have been the Palestinian journalists, and they have suffered a god-awful toll, surpassing World War II, surpassing some of the other major conflicts that lasted years and years longer. And frankly, Palestinian journalists are really fed up with how the mainstream media in the West has not come to their defense.
Absolutely. Let's remember the context here, right? So Israel for years has blocked key UN mechanisms, international investigative bodies, human rights organizations from entering Gaza. We did a whole report on this, I think, back in 2017 or 2018. And so journalists really were a critical lens, have been a critical lens for what's happening in Gaza. And of course, over the last 2 years, the Israeli government has blocked foreign journalists, for the most part, from entering Gaza, except when they're accompanying the military on, what can't really describe as anything else more than a kind of a propaganda, vision of reality. So we have all relied on the courageous journalists in Palestine to tell the story of what's happening on the ground. And they have been systematically, deliberately killed. And this is not even in contention. I mean, the Israeli government has directly said on their social media accounts and elsewhere that they've targeted numerous incident journalists, right? And even where they have not said journalists are the target, I mean, such as the recent attack, the double tap strike that took place at Nasser Hospital, they've clearly carried out their attack, at minimum, recklessly, with no regard for the obvious implications of journalists and others rushing to the scene after an Israeli attack and them being killed. But I think it's much more sinister when you see this happening on such a massive scale. There really is no other conclusion. And again, let's remember, this is not something that does not precedent. As early as the Gaza March of Return in 2018 and 2019, the UN Commission of Inquiry noted that the Israeli forces fired on journalists, among others, knowing who they were. So we know this is a pattern. Human Rights Watch has also documented it outside of Gaza. We've documented the deliberate killing of journalists by Israeli forces in Lebanon. We've reported on, killings in the West Bank. And again, it's not just killings. They have shut down access to Jazeera, for example. They have attacked their offices. They have, forbid them from reporting within the country. So when you look at, they've gone after their families. So when you take a look at the larger picture and context, it becomes even more clear that this is all part of a really deliberate strategy to block information out of Gaza. It's not a coincidence they struck Anas al-Sharif and the Jazeera team when they were in Gaza City on the eve of, Israel beginning its campaign there. It's the intent is I think relatively clear cut, and it's just undeniable. The numbers are overwhelming. They haven't been recorded at this scale. Killings of journalists in other contexts. And again, it's not just journalists. It's aid workers. It's so many other categories of people. It's attacking schools. It's attacking hospitals, healthcare workers. The list goes on and on.
Have we become numb to it?
I mean, it depends what we mean by we. Right. I mean, I think Palestinians are every day, despite it all, are continuing to tell their story to the world. And there continues to be courageous, brave souls. As we're speaking, there are activists joining another flotilla group that's, in the absence of international action, bringing aid themselves into Gaza. There have been prior flotillas. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are people responding. But I mean, to the gist of what I think you're asking, yes. I mean, I think even the news media, right? I mean, things that should be major news stories, the daily reality of death and destruction and starvation becomes more and more difficult to report after. And Israel's relying on that, right? It's relying on the fact. And they're being very open about their intentions. Israeli officials have been engaged in incitement to genocide for months. And, they're directly saying, we're going to, and they have been saying, and they continue to say, we're going to reduce Gaza to rubble. We're going to reduce Gaza City to rubble. And then they act on it. And much of this is recorded and live streamed to the world. And yet action isn't taken. It just boggles the mind.
You've had a chance to go out to university campuses and talk with students. And you must sense that there is a change there when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis that's been ongoing for decades. But suddenly it would seem that people's minds have changed. A lot of people, especially I think students, realize this didn't start on October the 7th.
Absolutely. I mean, look, there's been a shift happening for years. I think it predates the events the last 2 years, but certainly it's accelerated in some ways in recent months. And they're absolutely, I mean, I've probably spoken on 100 campuses over the last several years, and you absolutely see a shift that's taken place on these campuses because the younger generation see the reality for what it is. Their information is not filtered, by what the Israeli government wants you to see or what's in mass media. They, are on social media. They're able to hear accounts. And I think they understand the reality for what it is. And it's, for them, it's not, it's linked to, they understand that the what it looks like in Israel-Palestine is not so different than what they see in other contexts around the world. It's about structural repression. And there are ways to understand that with an understanding of what's happening elsewhere, in the globe. So there has been a shift, right? And I think as a result, the repression we're seeing, right, whether it be the crackdowns on campuses, the discipline against students, suspensions, whether it be even in some cases with foreign students recently, detention, prospect of deportation, that's also a reaction. And what it is Israel advocacy organizations, I think they know they've lost the debate, Jim. 30 years ago, when we were, students on campus, or even before that, there would be a debate, right? You would have a discussion. The supporters of the Israeli government would bring a speaker. Palestinians would bring a speaker. There would be a real discussion on the merits. But today, I think the supporters of the Israeli government know they can't win the debate on the merits, right? I mean, the facts are so overwhelming and so clear, and there's just no way you can sort of sugarcoat these mass atrocities and, these crimes against humanity and acts of genocide and apartheid and ethnic cleansing. People see it for what it is. So what are they doing? They're shutting down the debate. They are seeking to basically intimidate students to not speak out because they know they can't actually engage with them. And to an extent, that strategy is having some impact, right? I do think some of the repression has had a real chilling effect on students, but ultimately, it's not going to change, what people think. And ultimately, this generation are the ones that are going to be running newsrooms and, political campaigns and holding positions of powers in the years to come. But Israel's also making a calculation. Right. They, as we speak, are changing the reality on the ground at a breakneck speed. These shifts that we're talking about are glacial and slow. So they're trying to permanently change the map before these kinds of transformational changes set in. And so things need to move quicker because by the time these shifts take place, what's going to be left on the ground?
Well, to that very point, the Trump administration has come down solidly on the side of Israel. As we're recording this podcast, there's yet another demand, ultimatum from President Trump to Hamas, telling them that they've got to surrender all the hostages, surrender their arms, et cetera, basically concede defeat in this conflict. We don't know what's going to come out of that, but we hear voices on the West Bank, in the settlers movement, the hardliners saying that they've gotten the green light from the Trump administration to move ahead with ethnic cleansing, displacing Palestinians, seizing more land.
I mean, they've had the green light for a long time. Let's not pretend this is something new, right? They have not formally made an annexation announcement, but anyone who spent 5 minutes on the ground in the West Bank understands that de facto the West Bank is annexed. It's the Israeli government that controls that area, all aspects virtually of life. And they have methodically created a system to privilege Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians. That's a system that doesn't stop on the Green Line. It expands inside East Jerusalem, which Israel's annexed, inside Israel proper. And so that's long been the reality, right? And the reality here is, and this goes beyond Trump, right? I mean, the Trump administration obviously has deepened the complicity of the United States and in many cases has directly endorsed and openly, you could even say, encouraged mass atrocity crimes. And that's certainly a difference. But under the Biden administration, I mean, a lot of these things were taking place, not just in Gaza, but elsewhere. The U.S. has long failed to use its leverage to actually stop these abuses going across multiple different Israeli and U.S. governments. So that's all emboldened the Israeli government. They're precisely pushing forward and escalating because they know that they won't face consequence for doing so, not from the United States, which has long been complicit in some cases, and has given if not a de facto green light, at least a yellow light that they can go through. And they know when it comes to Europe and elsewhere that they might get statements of condemnation. There may be small action at the margins, but when it comes to real biting impact, suspending the EU-Israel Association agreement, actually taking, holding perpetrators to account, that's been lacking for years.
Well, the UN General Assembly is upcoming. President Trump said that, and Secretary Rubio said that they would revoke any visas for the Palestinian Authority president and others. And an overwhelming vote in the UN General Assembly said, well, if that's going to be the case, we'll move to Geneva. We'll move the UN General Assembly to Geneva. What impact does that have?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's clear that this is a vindictive administration that wants, the world to tow to their dictates, which bear no, international law, humanitarian principles bear little relation to that. So certainly the actions against the revocation of visas to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PA, is in that vein, and it's not a coincidence again that this is a General Assembly which marks the 1-year anniversary of the issuance of a UN General Assembly resolution that built on an International Court of Justice ruling that found Israel's occupation illegal. It called for settlements to be dismantled. It called for wide-ranging action and found Israel to be responsible for apartheid. And it gave a 1-year mandate for Israel to end its unlawful presence in the occupied territory and, mentioned actions that states should take in reaction. So obviously, the U.S. is focused on several states that have said they will, in one form or another, recognize Palestine at the General Assembly. And this is their way of seeking retribution against them, even though, of course, recognition of itself, absence concrete action, risks being a symbolic, meaningless gesture. But again, it just shows how this administration is operating here, right? It is, it is not only doing the Israeli government's bidding, but in many cases, sacrificing the very foundations of the international rule-based order to shield, Israel from any form of accountability.
How many years have you been actually working on the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
I mean, I've been in this role for almost 9 years now. I mean, I've worked on many other human rights issues, but obviously, Israel-Palestine, even beyond my role at Human Rights Watch, has been something that I've worked on that goes back, a couple of decades. So, this is this has gone on for a while.
Israelis have rights, and there have to be concerns about those rights as well. There's a focus on what's happening to the Palestinians, but there was another terror attack recently in Jerusalem, 6 people killed. And when we see this spinning violence and the attitudes of some people within the IDF and in the settlers movement, when we see what's happened to the Palestinians, I really fear that we're having a breakdown where we're looking at generations to come that are going to be radicalized by the violence that they have witnessed on both sides.
Look, I mean, it's a very basic point, but I mean, these cycles of bloodshed and oppression, of course, have been happening, right? And there's a structural reality there. This isn't two equal sides, tit for tatting, of course, but you're not going to actually stop that cycle unless you deal with root causes of the recurring abuses. And that includes Israel's apartheid and persecution against the Palestinian people. So it's critical that those things are dealt with. If you only focus on the kind of immediate, which has been the international community's approach, right? It's been a Band-Aid approach. It's tried to see human rights abuses through the peace process lens. So the idea being, well, if we just, agree to a peace proposal, we can sort of deal. But that's not the right answer, right? You have to deal with the root causes, and you have to. We all want a political solution one day, that allows all the people living there, to remain, that deals with everybody's fundamental rights. But that's not coming around the corner. And the idea that we can continue to condemn generations to live under structural oppression with significant abuses until there's political will for a process is just the wrong way to go about it. We need to we can't treat structural oppression as symptoms. We have to treat them as the root and deal with them at the root. And of course, this isn't, Jewish Israelis have suffered, right? Human Rights Watch, we've documented the grave crimes committed on October 7th, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. We have documented the illegality in the war crime of hostage taking. We've documented, a range of grave abuses over the years, and those need to be there. And our calls are consistent, right? There needs to be accountability for these crimes. There needs to be states willing to, they shouldn't be funding abusive security forces, whether it's, the Israeli military or whether it's abusive Hamas or PA security forces. If the international community took a consistent rights-based approach rooted in principles of international law, I think we'd be in a very different place. And it could be dealt with in not a matter of generations, right? I think if you deal with root causes and you dismantle these structures of repression, there are many examples of Israelis and Palestinians coexisting, right? It's not, it's not something you can do overnight, and there will need to be a process for both societies. But the issue is not, people hating each other, right? The issue is the underlying repression. And if you deal in the human rights abuse and the impunity for it, and if you deal with that, you can find a way for everybody to live together. But that's...
Well, you bring up a word there, impunity. And anyone who looks at the history of this, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, impunity has been a huge part of it because it encourages more and greater abuses.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is the rule of thumb anywhere. I used to work on Egypt for Human Rights Watch, and I can tell you, I remember and I documented the Rabaa massacre, the mass killings of protesters after the military coup in 2013. And I remember sitting there saying that if there's not accountability for this, that will be the green light for more abuses. And indeed, one of the architects of that massacre is now the president of Egypt, and we've seen ongoing tens of thousands detained and repression continue. It's a universal rule. When forces know that they will not be held to account, abuses will recur, right? Because that's the nature of things, right? Accountability is at the core of preventing further abuses, right? And so the impunity that's existed for so long is really a root cause and needs to be dealt with. And it's clear that it won't be dealt with by in Israel-Palestine, right? There isn't any prospect of real accountability. We've seen that over decades in the Israeli court system, which is, as the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem has put it, a whitewash mechanism. The International Criminal Court's probe is a key fora for accountability, but there are others. There are the possibility of prosecutions under the principle of universal jurisdiction around the world. Those are really critical in order for there to be a real meaningful and sustainable shift.
We have not, and I've covered this conflict for 30 years more, and, never seen anything close to this kind of devastation, what we're looking at in Gaza right now and what may lie ahead in Gaza City. I wonder if I can ask you to look in. Do you have any predictions? What do you think is going to happen? Mass ethnic cleansing?
Look, I mean, the prediction game is a difficult one, right? But what I can tell you is we can see what Israel's done in other areas where look what happened in Rafah, right? I mean, where Israel followed a similar playbook. They flirted with the idea of and by the way, in Rafah, they met a lot more resistance. There are people saying this is a red line, don't go in. And yet, what do we have today? I mean, Rafah has been ethnically cleansed. It's been virtually razed to the ground, and there are virtually no Palestinians that are really living there, right? And so that's what Israel seeks to do in Gaza City. And of course, Gaza City was in many ways the heart of beating life of Gaza. And every day we see reports about mass demolitions and airstrikes and killings. And so, I think we have to see what's happening in Gaza City.
That's a huge population there in Gaza City. You just don't make 1 million people disappear.
And Israel should know that because it tried to make 1 million people disappear in October of 2023. That was the initial displacement orders were for North Gaza, right? And many of those people did leave, not all, right? And many of them went to the south. And what happened? When the ceasefire came into place in January, many went back because there is no safe place in Gaza. The shelters, the schools have been under systematic attack. And people have run out of places to go. So many people just went back. Most of their homes were destroyed and their buildings were damaged or destroyed. So they went to live in tents near where they used to live, right? And so, and when Israel resumed hostilities in March, of course, everywhere was under attack. So people stayed and Israel's trying to undo that, right? But people have nowhere to go, right? 2 million people who are meeting nothing but mass starvation, killing, displacement everywhere they turn.
People have asked, what can I do? People have asked, they want to do something positive, whether they're Israeli, whether they're Jewish Americans, Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, they want to somehow be involved in a positive way. And they ask, so what can I do?
Look, I mean, it's a good question. I think the number one thing is, and it comes back to something you asked me earlier, we can't be fatigued about this. We can't think, well, it's over. I can't stand the images anymore. I can't look, right? Because again, yes, way more than 60,000 people have been killed. I mean, the number from the Ministry of Health is probably a lower bound estimate given indirect cause of death, etc. But regardless, there still are many more people still there that are every day waking up and, struggling to find food and water amid Israel's starvation campaign, that are struggling to live. And so we owe it to them, and we owe it to all those who have been killed, right? That those deaths of civilians, of women and children, don't go in vain. So I think that means at a baseline level, not turning away from Gaza. Everybody, it's difficult to say what everybody should do because it depends where you're situated, how you engage, what mechanisms are available to you, and but people should be speaking out. People should be pushing their representatives. There are actions that governments should take. Many governments are. It's perverse in some ways, but the level of atrocities on the ground does create openings to push governments to do things that once seemed impossible. Arms embargoes, suspending preferential trade agreements, with Israel, targeted sanctions on Israeli officials. Every country, there are different battles along these lines being fought. And I think having mass movements that are supporting them, and again, it doesn't just mean people should just focus on moving their elected or their political representatives or their government representatives. There are things they can do in their own community, especially if you live in the United States or other countries that have deep institutional complicity in what's happening, right? It means looking much more, looking at your own communities, right? Are there, businesses? Are there other institutions that have complicity in what's happening, and what can you do to push for an end to that complicity? So I think there are things everybody can do, and what you do is going to depend on where you're situated. But the thing you can't do is be silent. You got to speak out, and you got to do what you can, because right now we know it's not going to change from within. The Israeli government's not going to stop these atrocities. There have been mass movements on the Israeli streets for months. It's going to need international serious pressure for there to be a shift.
Omer Shakir has not given up. Maybe fatigued, but you're hanging in there. We appreciate you taking the time and joining us here on The Brief.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. Please explore many of our other episodes of The Brief Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a like or subscribe. For a complete listing, you can find more information at thebriefpodcast.org. For now, I'm Jim Clancy, and you've been briefed.